So I think we ought to start with the idea of, let me go. Let's begin with remembering who Jacob is. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. He is the heir of the blessing that he stole from his twin brother Esau. Now, Jacob is kind of a snake. His story is very challenging, and he's kind of a selfish, egotistical jerk. That's what he seems to be throughout his arc of the story in Genesis. He is not obviously the good brother. He's the sneaky brother, and he finds a way to get what he wants rather than what is probably best. So here he is. He had to run away because he stole his brother's blessing and his brother wanted to kill him. So he ran away. While he was gone for a long time, he got married twice and had a bunch of kids. And so now they're coming home, and he is going to confront his brother, take his lumps, and hope he can survive. That's his sort of plan. And when he approaches the river, he sees his brother up on the other side, and he doesn't, and kind of freaks out. He sends his family over there because in hopes that his brother will be nice to them. And he's holding back, kind of confused, not knowing what to do. And while he's on the other side of the river, God comes to him and wrestles with him through the night. It's a really shocking moment. He obviously not what he expected, not what any of us would have expected in that circumstance. And he's wrestling, and in the midst of it, he is equally matched with God in this wrestling, in this moment. And he gets this sort of knock to his hip, and it drives them apart. And from then on, he walks with a limp. And the sort of place is renamed because of his survival of his confrontation with God. Because remember, the idea was that you could not see God face to face and live. And this particular person, not the best person, managed to do that. Where the story goes, of course, from here is really quite fascinating. His brother, he goes across, and he's about to sort of confess to his brother and let him do what he needs to do, and his brother's like goes and hugs him. It's just like the prodigal son story. He hugs him. He's like, "You're back. The dead is alive." It's fascinating. One of the challenges one of the things that I am always drawn to in this story is this idea of wrestling with God, and this idea that it is particularly not something that we in the Episcopal Church, or we in the United States in the 21st century feel very comfortable with this idea of wrestling with God, that would be normal, that we would confront and that we would get dirty trying to understand what God is doing, that we could survive such a thing. We often refer to this as sort of, we think we will die, or that our faith will die if we confront what God is really up to. So we hide from it. We run away. And this is a story that really pushes us away from doing that. It has really become for me an opportunity to see how I connect and where I am, in hopes that I can be better. That it's okay. It's okay to confront and wrestle and fight and try to make sense of what is happening with our faith at the moment. I think it's really useful. I think at the same time, we need that wrestling to help us understand the gospel story today. As part of this is very different from the way we normally talk about these things, and this one in particular. It's very familiar. We often refer to this as the feeding of the 5,000, though I prefer the feeding of the multitudes. It has it's a different focus. But this one, it begins with a very similar refrain that we know from just a couple of weeks ago, that Jesus withdrew, got himself on a boat, and put a boat between him and the people. This is something that just happened in chapter 13. So he's put himself in a distant space from the people, and yet they follow him. He's trying to get away. He's trying to get some alone time, and yet they follow him. And when he looks, he feels sympathy for them and comes back and helps them. There's a way in which this looks to us a little bit like an example of taking this as an example of how the shepherd needs to never stop working, to constantly feed the sheep, that the sheep are extremely needy, and it's sort of a justification of overworking. But that's not how this actually plays out. Perhaps that is something you can glean from the beginning, but it's not where Jesus goes with it. So notice what is probably the most striking thing about this story, and it's something that we easily overlook because it is altogether too familiar. But the disciples go up to Jesus, and Jesus is like, feed them. And they're like, you know what? I think we should just send them home. We can't possibly feed all these people. So let's just send all these people away. Let them fend for themselves. And then maybe they'll come back. And the reason they do this, of course, is they then say, because we can't afford to feed them, we don't have any money, and we don't have enough food, we can't even feed ourselves. How could we feed them? So it's in this moment of scarcity, how could we possibly function? And Jesus says, well, feed them. What have you got? And Jesus manages, with the disciples collecting this food, they manage to feed everybody. Now, this is one of our favorites, and we love to talk about the miracle here, and we love to imagine the sort of miraculousness that happens with gathering, and when we all get together and we eat. Episcopalians love this story. But I want to remind us about what is happening right there in the middle of the story, this tension right at the center, which is the sense of we don't have enough. We couldn't possibly send them away. And Jesus is confronting them in the midst of their frustration and their confusion. Feed them. In a sense, this is the flip of that first reading the first version of this reading that we were just saying. That, in a sense, this is a lot like that initial reading we had, or that we were talking about. In a sense, this is like that initial. In a sense, this is like that initial reading, in which we were talking about the overfunctioning of the leader. And Jesus doesn't feed all the people. Jesus doesn't avoid going away for respite and feeding all the people because they're desperate. He helps connect all the people and says, we are doing this. So let's all do this because we are doing a thing together. This is really a story about the disciples, a story about what they're capable of, which is doing the very things Christ is doing, that they themselves are the manifestation of Christ in our world. That's about the people. Often we take this story as if it's a story about the miracles that Jesus can do for us, but really it's a story of the miracles Jesus does through us. It's a story about what we can do. So I'm mindful of this moment and what we're probably reeling from and dealing with. And I encourage all of us to think about what it is to be wrestling right now and what it means to be the hands and feet of Christ, what it means to be doing this work, what it means to be participating in a thing, something that may be easy or may be hard, something that we may want to do or something we want to avoid. But it's a thing that requires us all. It's not a thing for other people. It's a thing for us. It's a thing for all of us. It's a thing we do together. And it doesn't matter whether we think it is the right thing to do in a permanent thing. In a sense, it doesn't matter if it's the right thing in an objective sense, in a permanent and eternal sense. There's a thing in which we recognize a moment, and how are we doing this together? How are we, all of us, doing this together? So in this moment in which I'm on vacation and you are where you are, I hope that that you are recognize how much stronger we are when we are how much stronger we are when we're with Jesus with us. And this is a story. I commend to you this week the challenge of wrestling not just with what's going on in the world, but wrestling with your part in it. How are you wrestling with what God is calling us to do? God is calling us in the midst of suffering to alleviate suffering, in the midst of anxiety to bring hope, in the midst of death bringing life. There are so many challenges we have in our society and in ourselves, and we are given the opportunity to wrestle with both. Not one or the other, both. What's going on in here and what's going on out there. I invite you into this work with me, with your friends, with all of your neighbors, because we have a lot in store for us.